It's nice to see so many of you here from all over the world. For those of you who don't know me, I'm 𝘊𝘶𝘭𝘵𝘮𝘀. I'm one of the two co-directors of Circle, the host for this event, together with my colleague Beatrice Dupuy, and I also have here the Associate Director Kate Mackay and our Outreach Coordinator 𝘊𝘰𝘮𝘭𝘵𝘮𝑦𝑒. So we'll be the team who'll be supporting you today. So we're Circle. We're the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy. So we're one of 16 Title VI language resource centers in the US. And our mission is to provide professional development, so events such as this, as well as other kinds of resources and materials for language teaching and learning. So we'll be popping a link for our website there in the chat. So if you want to find out more about us and about the work that we do and that the other language resource centers do, please go ahead and follow those links after the webinar today. I do want to focus your attention before we get started here today to a couple of other upcoming events. So this is the first in a three-part webinar series that will be focusing on social justice and transformative learning in foreign language teaching. And so this is the first of basically 3 talks that will all have some connections together. So go ahead and look for those if you haven't had a chance to sign up for the other 2 talks that are coming October 3rd and October 17th. You'll be able to find information about that on our website, and we'll also pop a link to that registration in the chat there shortly. Before we go ahead and move to the introductions, just a couple of points of order. You've already all figured out, I think, that the chat is a good place for putting some comments and some greetings. We'll be using that primarily for those kinds of comments and for troubleshooting. So if you have any issues with the technology that you think we can help you with, go ahead and put that in there. But there is also a Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see Q&A. And if you have questions during the talk, go ahead and post them in there. You can even do them as they come into your head, and we'll be having space for discussion and for questioning at that point and be coming back to those. So for questions for the speaker, use that Q&A, and for anything else, comments and troubleshooting, use that chat. All right, with no further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome today L.J. Randolph, who is going to be beginning this first of the 3-part series. L.J. Randolph is Associate Professor of Spanish and Education and Coordinator of the World Language Teacher Education Program at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. His work in his teaching and his research relates to curriculum development broadly. He works on Spanish for native speakers and for heritage learners specifically, and then he's done a lot of amazing work around the topic that we'll be hearing about today, so related to culture, politics, and social justice and world language education. And he's published and presented on these topics in a variety of venues, but I'm going to highlight one publication in particular, and that's an article that he wrote together with Stacy Johnson called Social Justice in the Language Classroom, A Call to Action, which is a really wonderful article and really relevant to what he'll be speaking about today. So we'll also pop another link that is to a resource sheet on social justice resources, and you'll find information about how to access that article there if you want to read up afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead now and end my show and turn the floor over to our speaker today, L.J. Randolph. And please join me in virtually clapping your hands and welcoming him to the webinar.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be here and to speak with my colleagues. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and I think that is very timely and important, you know, no matter what is going on in the world, but especially now. So thank you to Circle, and thank you to all of you for attending. And I look forward to speaking with you. I hope that this will be engaging, and we'll, like was explained earlier, we will stop and have time for questions and answers. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts about all of this. So. I want to begin by talking about what the goals of this presentation are. So hopefully we'll be able to explain a little bit about how social justice builds and expands upon existing theory, research, and practice in language education and education in general. I think social justice fits nicely into existing theory, and then also what we already know and what we already do as language educators. We'll explore how social justice approaches can seamlessly be implemented into our current language teaching practices. discuss and share on the implementation of social justice in the language classroom, identify and implement technological tools for resource selection and student engagement, and finally, imagine how we can work with others to move forward with social justice-oriented pedagogies in our own individual contexts. And so a very general outline of what this presentation will look like. We'll look at some of the foundations, some of the theory. We'll look at some examples from my own classes and from my colleagues' classes of how we sort of wrestle with this and put it into practice in our own classrooms. I think it's important to see what it actually looks like. Even though we'll talk about later how social justice, I don't think is about just a list of practices. It's really about our perspectives and our dispositions. But that does influence our practices. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that might look like in the classroom. And then throughout, and hopefully at the end, we'll also have time for questions and discussion. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about my professional journey. I do not consider myself to be an expert, nor do I consider myself to sort of have an objective voice when it comes to talking about themes of social justice oriented pedagogies and social justice education. So I think it's important to know a little bit about my journey and where I'm coming from. I started learning, I'm from rural North Carolina, the southeastern coast of North Carolina, which is currently where I live. I work at an institution in southeastern North Carolina, right on the coast. And I began Spanish in 10th grade. So I took Spanish 1, 10th grade. And it was I liked school, so I think it was a positive experience, as were all of my classes, right? Because I just, you know, I like learning, and I liked engaging in classes. That was never really an issue with me. But I will say, even though I like the idea of learning Spanish, I didn't really see myself in the curriculum at all. It was always something where it was, this is what other people speak, people who don't look like me, who don't live near me, and this is just a way to study about something that's very abstract and quite literally foreign, foreign language, quite literally foreign to me. And then that second picture, that's me with 2 of my colleagues. We started teaching the same year in 2003 at Chapel Hill High School in North Carolina. And we're all still Spanish teachers in some capacity. So I think that's cool that we all started our career at the same time, same place, and we're still doing the same thing almost 20 years later, right? And what happened in college is I took a linguistics course. I started out as a math major, and I took a linguistics class as an elective. And I sort of fell in love with the idea of studying languages. And then when I started taking more of those advanced classes at the college level, that's when I really learned, wow, there are people who look like me who speak Spanish. And it is a more immediate experience than I had imagined before. And so I think I formed a more intimate relationship with the language and with the people who speak the language. But that didn't happen until I was in college. And then finally, in the lower right-hand corner there, that's what I currently do. I work at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and I get to work with students who are pre-service teachers as they are learning how to teach. And so it's just so exciting to every year be with people who are just super optimistic about the teaching profession and are learning about how to teach, and they come with all these exciting ideas, and it's just cool to watch them blossom in the classroom. So I love that aspect of my job. And my interest in social justice sort of came from my own desire to connect with my students. and wanting students to discover and know that language can ultimately be a unifying and empowering experience at all levels, from Spanish 1, which is the language I teach, all the way up through graduate school and beyond, right? You don't have to wait until your language skills allow you to engage critically. You don't have to wait until you can write essays and do term papers and do research before you can engage in some of these critical topics. And so that's sort of where my perspective with that came from. I want to share with you a tweet recently that someone posted. They were trying to be snarky, I think, but I don't remember what the context of this was. I don't remember what I said, but their response is in the box below my my quote. They said, "What can you expect from a man whose job is to teach languages, but thinks his job is teaching social justice while teaching languages?" And I thought, you know what, that's actually a pretty good description of how I envision what I do. I don't think language proficiency is the only goal of a language class. And if we're being honest, and especially in my own context, most students, the reality is most students, after they take that required language class, they don't continue in their language. They take other classes that they need for their own minors or majors. And so I think a lot about what lasting experiences can I give students in my class, even if they don't go on to achieve proficiency in the language. And I think that's the case for many of our students. I would definitely say most of our students, probably almost all. So that's sort of the perspective that I take with regard to language education, and why I think it's so important to incorporate social justice in our classes and to think about who we want our students to be, what we want our students to know, what important skills do we want our students to have beyond the inherent language skills that we think of when we think of a language class. And so I already said this word a lot of times: social justice, social justice, social justice. So what do I mean by that? I think it can become a throwaway term, and if we don't really focus on what we're talking about, it loses its meaning. And so here is our first chance to test out the comment and the Q&A part of this webinar. I would like for you in the chat box or Q&A or wherever to say, what words or phrases do you associate with the term social justice? They're coming in so fast. Wow. I need to expand the window so I can see more responses at once. I see activism. I see a lot of equity, diversity, fairness, awareness, changing the world, Black Lives Matter, inclusion, power, decolonialism, fairness, again, treating everyone fairly, warrior, anti-racism, support, tolerance, humanization, diversification, understanding, observation, awareness, intersectional, voices, pushback, acceptance, empathy, gender equity, opportunities, feminism, consciousness, respect. So I like all of that. And my whole point in doing this is to say that really, I don't think there is one right answer. It is so subjective, right? And so I always struggle about if and how to define that term. But from my perspective, when I think of it, I think of sort of an equitable distribution of power, tangible and intangible resources. And I saw someone mention this earlier in the comments, mattering, this whole idea of mattering. So you're valued enough to be visible, to be important, and to be heard. And that definitely is a callback to Black Lives Matter. And so I also want to turn to social media. I don't know if people who, you might be in this presentation, if you're attending and you comment on social media about social justice, you may find yourself quoted here. But here are what some of my colleagues say. So social justice is the lens through which all pedagogy should be viewed. It should inform the way that we see our students and our instruction, and it should be embedded throughout our lessons. And what I like about this definition, this is from, I believe it was last year, 2019, Stacey Margarita Johnson and I put this question out for another workshop that we were doing about social justice. And we just wanted to know what people thought about social justice. Oh, thank you, Kate, for making that list of responses that were in the Q&A. I forgot to check the Q&A. So equity, fairness, respect, critical thinking, anti-racism, equal rights to learn, allies, and critical thinking. And so what I like about this particular definition is this idea of it being part of the daily experience of our students. It's, quote, embedded throughout our lessons. And so I think that's important with the way that I think about social justice. It's something that we, it integrates with what we're already doing. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that later, and about how we can use social justice to support the language and culture skills that we're already trying to include in our classes. And that's actually the theme of this workshop. How do we approach cultural and linguistic competence through a social justice lens? Another one, teaching social justice must occur not simply because it's relevant, but so my students can explore how their stories fit into the larger tapestry of a national and global story. And I think it's important to keep in mind that some groups cannot remove themselves from certain issues or pretend to have an objective voice. And so it's important for us to think about student stories and incorporate that into our classes, and think about what we can do to validate those stories that are often untold. Right? So it's not just some objective concept, but it's something that's relevant to our own stories and the stories of the students who are in our classes. And then, of course, there are interrelated concepts when we think about social justice. And so you have social justice, which we just talked a lot about. You have intercultural communicative competence, which Michael Byron would describe as the ability to understand cultures other than your own and to use that understanding to communicate effectively. And then you have critical pedagogy. And Stacey Margarita Johnson and I sort of define that as any classroom practice that addresses difference, power, or social stratification in the classroom or in the world. So I definitely think these concepts are related. And even more broadly, I think social justice relates to other critical theories, both within the field of language education and also more generally in other fields like education in general and social sciences in general. And so we recognize that social justice sort of intersects with and plays nice with these other critical theories and frameworks. So just really quickly, I'm not going to do any of these justice, but I just want to give you a place where you can go to get more information or to think more about each of these. So culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies, Gloria Latson-Billings, Django Paris have done a lot of work with that. And the idea here, dating back to critical pedagogy with Freire, we're not just acknowledging or accepting cultures, but we are explicitly embedding them into the curriculum. And into our social justice frameworks, into our critical pedagogy, right? So it goes back to that idea of mattering. Multiculturalism, 𝘊𝘶 Nieto is a great resource for that, including things of affirmation, solidarity, and critique in the context of diverse perspectives. Critical race theory, looking at intersections. I think someone mentioned intersectionality in the comments when we talked about social justice, but thinking about intersections of race, power, and policy in a society. Queer theory, that was mentioned as well in the comments. Critique of socially constructed notions of gender and sexuality. And I think that's very relevant to the language classroom, just from a linguistic perspective, because in English, you know, we have Latinx, and we're starting to use the singular they, even though it's always existed, but now as a non-binary identifier, using the singular they in that way. And just thinking about if you teach a language like Spanish that's gendered, where you have, say, for example, in some contexts, it's completely arbitrary, like la pared or el suelo, the wall is feminine, the floor is masculine, el, and the wall is la, feminine, and it is completely arbitrary. But then there are other cases where there are some underlying assumptions. For example, if you look at a traditional dictionary in Spanish, you might only see the masculine form of pilot, el piloto. You might not find the feminine form, la pilota or la piloto, unless you look at a more contemporary dictionary. And then the idea that víctima, victim, is always a feminine word in Spanish. And then sociolinguistics, Nelson Flores, Jonathan Rosa, looking at the idea of intersections of race and language identity. Transformative learning, Zach Mesereau, which transformative learning is this constructivist theory in which students engage in critical reflection to sort of reinterpret and transform their own perspectives. And so I think the reflective processes that we want students to engage in relate to that a lot. And so that's sort of what social justice is. Equally important, what do I not mean by social justice? What is social justice not? What are the misconceptions, especially when we think about social justice in the language classroom? So again, I turn to Twitter. So you can see, read Steve Kaufman's comment first. This is someone who knows a lot of languages, very prominent polyglot in Twitter, and he says language teachers should help students learn languages and not take advantage of having captive listeners upon whom to impose the teacher's ideas of quote unquote social justice. And I think that, to be fair, I think that is a common misconception about what we mean by social justice. And so I want to clear that up. Social justice is inherently not teacher-centered. So it's not teachers taking advantage of a captive audience. It's not about imposing one's way of viewing the world. We're not trying to create an echo chamber where we're all patting ourselves on the back. It actually is about being honest. And I love the vulnerability that comes with that, especially when there's trust along with that vulnerability. For example, if I'm going to share some lessons with you today, and you may critique them. You may say, hey, did you think about this? Or how about adding this element? Or did you think about how students might view this in a negative way? And so I think that's important. I think it is important to challenge one another and to continue to call each other higher. And it's also important to realize that social justice is not something that happens in addition to language learning. The two are inextricably linked, I believe. And it's even more important, social justice is not the opposite of neutrality. It doesn't exist on a continuum where on one end you have this completely objective approach to teaching languages, and then on the other hand you have this completely politicized social justice approach. There is no neutral position. Language learning is subjective and political by its very nature. I mentioned this text earlier, and I think in the intro, 𝘊𝘶 does a great job of explaining sort of the essence of Freire's text. He says there is no such thing as a neutral educational process. You're either going to bring about conformity to the status quo, or you're going to teach students how to deal critically and creatively with their reality and with the transformation of their world. And I saw in one of the comments that someone mentioned that social justice is about changing the world. And then again, I have a couple of other tweets that I think are important in setting the stage for what we'll talk about a little bit later. So this idea of being culturally responsive and incorporating social justice, I talked about this earlier, it's not a set of strategies. So I can't say this is how you do this. And if you do this, you're implementing social justice. It's a mindset. And so it means that we as educators have to be involved in in transformative processes and reflective processes ourselves in order to do this and to remain engaged in this type of work. And so I do always share specific strategies to try to make it practical and tangible, but it really is about teachers taking into consideration what works best for their context and their students. And then here, I think is also important, excuse me. I think it's also important to think about how we can challenge the idea of portraying marginalized communities as victims in need of being rescued. So I love this tweet here that talks about focusing on grassroots movements, focusing on empowerment. It's not about victimization or placing ourselves in a role of cultural savior. And it's not all doom and gloom either. I mean, I think, you know, if you are a marginalized person, and if you're talking about marginalized people, yeah, there is oppression that goes with their story. And so we do talk about that, but there are also inspiring and empowering elements that are related to that as well. And so I can pause here, and I think I see that someone, at least one person had their hand up or had a question in the Q&A. We can pause here and answer a couple of questions.
We definitely have one question in the Q&A. So how do we get online degree programs in particular away from their reliance on prepackaged, published, social justice-free curriculum textbooks as a required basis for language classes, because they basically create this existing curriculum that forces people to make social justice on top of what's already there in the textbook?
So are we talking about, and I guess the person who wrote this question could clarify in the chat. We're talking about add-ons to teacher education programs or add-ons to the curriculum for language learners themselves?
Oh, okay. Hope is saying she's thinking specifically of something like portales 1 through 2 for language learners. So more the kind of textbooks. And I think that's relevant for those of us who don't teach Spanish as well, that often the textbook is so prepackaged that it feels like there's not space. So how do you kind of push back on textbook publishers or online publishers in some way, or navigate that the way that those textbooks present themselves as being so whole?
Okay, yeah. I can speak a little bit to that. In my institution for the first 4 semesters, so 101, 102, 201, 202 of Spanish at least, we all have a common textbook that we use, and I think the textbook has issues that we see in a lot of those types of curriculum materials where they're just issues, even with representation. I think representation is like the lowest bar, like just having, just representing diverse perspectives, but that can't be it. You do have to, you know, engage and critically look at the perspectives of those people that you're representing as well. But I think in a lot of texts, there's just issues with representation. And what I try to do is I use the textbook because students do pay for it and it is expensive. And so I don't feel like I can just say, you know, we're not going to use the textbook at all. But I use it more for reinforcement of language. So for practice of language outside of the class, that kind of thing. But in terms of what actually drives the curriculum and the themes in my class, I try to base that on sources that I find outside of the textbook that represent the diverse perspectives of people who speak that language. And at the end of the presentation, I actually have an example of how I work with the student to take an activity from the textbook or a topic from the textbook and teach that from a more critical perspective, while also incorporating the same language functions and forms that were part of that particular chapter. So hopefully that will help clarify that question as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. For those of you who have your hands up, just go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, or if you've got a comment, go ahead and put that in the chat, because we don't have a good way to unmute with a group this big. So, so go ahead and put those in there. We do have one other question, if you don't mind me throwing it out to you right now. It might be something
Sure.
you're back to, but Rachel asked—
And again, I'm not the expert, so hopefully you all are answering these questions in the chat box as well. So
yeah, I see that. I'm delighted to see that people are kind of throwing additional ideas out there, and we'll make sure that both you, LJ, and anyone who's here gets a copy of that chat afterwards. So if you want to go back to it, you'll have that as a resource. So Rachel was asking about what types of language can be used to describe collaboration to support marginalized communities in a way that doesn't position them as victims. If you have kind of recommendations about how you go out, what kinds of language to use, how to go about speaking so that you avoid that pitfall.
So I think like just really simple, just with versus for. So working with communities and instead of feeling like you're sort of serving a community, because a lot of times those communities are already engaged in their own liberation. I can't think of a context where someone from outside of a marginalized community will come in and say, hey, have you thought about ways that you can experience liberation? It's like, yeah, we're thinking about that. You know, how can you support what we already do, or how can you let those voices be the leader of the work? So I think that's important. If you're engaged in like a community service activity or something like that, who's leading the activity? So.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful, just the framing of not for, but with already puts you in a different direction. Do you want to take a couple more questions?
Well, we'll go on and then we'll stop again soon.
That sounds good. So go ahead, and if you have other questions, put them in there. I'm tracking them, so we won't lose sight of them, I promise. Okay.
And I'll, this part, we know so well anyway, but I did want to, remember I said the topic of this presentation is linguistic and cultural learning outcomes through a social justice lens. And you'll see with the other people who present, when Michelle and Stacy do their presentations, you'll see that there are many elements to explore about social justice oriented pedagogies, and our own subjectivity and positionality affects the way that we even approach the same topic. So even if somebody else did a presentation on this exact same topic, it will look very different. And I think that's the beauty of social justice. And that's why we need to have diverse people involved in the conversation, and who are also, you know, diverse people who are in our profession as well. Looking at our standards, so we have communication, you know, interpersonal, interpretive, presentational, thinking about listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Cultures, thinking about how practices and products and perspectives all connect with one another. Connections, looking at multidisciplinary learning. Comparisons, making linguistic and cultural comparisons. And I want to just emphasize, when I think of comparisons, I don't think about the sort of Venn diagram, us versus them, how are we alike, how are we different kind of thing. I think about how does diversity affect the way that we interpret the same situation, or how does our diversity affect the way that we have various forms of cultural expression within the same physical context. So not creating an us versus them, because I think that sort of reinforces this whole idea of foreignness with the language. and then helping our students to be lifelong learners and thinking about how we can engage with the language in both our global communities and our immediate communities. And so we as a profession know and understand that language learning isn't only about grammar and vocabulary, and it's not really even just about communication, because communication is only one of the 5 C's of the World Readiness Standards. So it encompasses so much more than that. And I think we all know and we understand, and we probably all love the fact that we can and should include so much more in language instruction. But I think when we start talking about social justice, it becomes an issue of like something else to do. I don't have time for that. I can't do it. I've already had, my curriculum is already full. I got to have these students, they got to learn this verb list by the time they're in the next level kind of thing. And I hope to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that social justice is not an add-on. It can and should be embedded into the DNA of our curriculum. And then I have here, if you're a human read, a couple, I told you there are a lot of tweets in this presentation. So these are a couple of other tweets from our colleagues. It's in the fiber of how I teach. I intentionally create time for history and current events connected to Latinx people. And so I think that intentionality is an important piece. And then this tweet from Dory, teachers will say, well, my curriculum is so packed, I don't have time for Black History Month or whatever critical topic you want to put in there. But then at the same time, look at all of these Valentine's activities that I made for my class. So I think if we are critical and intentional about the way that we approach our curriculum design and implementation, that we can find that, wow, there are lots of opportunities for social justice to be embedded into what I already do. I think traditionally teachers have used that cultures and community standards as a window to try to incorporate critical pedagogies, but there have been a few problems. So Vicki Galloway talks about some of the traditional approaches to studying culture. So you have the 4F approach, which is folk dances, festivals, foods, and fairs kind of thing. The tour guide approach, where you're concerned about identification of monuments, rivers, cities. The by the way approach, if you have a textbook, it's where they have that little box in the corner of the textbook. Hey, here's this cool cultural fact about this target culture that you probably didn't know. Look how different they are from how you are, kind of thing. And then the Frankenstein approach, this is where you throw in the stereotypical elements every now and then, like a bullfighter, a flamenco dancer, a taco, that kind of thing. And so the results of that are that students have a distorted view of the world. It reinforces stereotypes that students already had, and it might even give them new ideas, right? It might give them new stereotypes that they hadn't even considered before. And I think it's dangerous because culture becomes content rather than the critical deconstruction of the dynamic nature of these communities and their lived experiences. And so I have another chance here for brief reflection from the audience. So think about a time when you implemented or considered implementing culture in a critical and meaningful way in your classroom. What were some of the challenges of engaging students critically with the study of culture? So Kate, or one of the other moderators, you might have to help me. Language barrier, that's a big one. And we'll talk about that. Stereotypes are a big barrier. Being okay with a brief discussion in English and not the target language. And I think that's okay. I feel that in my classes, and you'll see some examples of this, there are times when I encourage students to engage in translanguaging and to engage in using English if that's their native language. And I think it's fine, because otherwise I feel comfortable with the amount of comprehensible input that they do get in Spanish. So I don't think it takes away from what they're already learning in the class. Biases, lack of exposure, time. And I think the time issue is why it's so important to try to think about how we can embed it into what we're sort of already expected or required to teach, even in some contexts. So it looks like the bias is one of the biggest things that people have trouble with. And then getting students to that next level, to think about nuance, different perspectives, while also, you know, trying to keep most of it in the target language. So yeah. And I see here about the not to encourage the white savior complex, about communities in need of being rescued. And I like Hope's comment there about starting with the culture, social justice, and proficiency all combined and bringing the vocabulary and grammar that we need rather than the other way around. And that is, I mean, and I'm not saying there's only one way to do this. Like I said earlier, it's all about your context and what works best for you and your students. But I do something similar to what Hope is talking about. In our textbook, for example, you know, based on the resources that I select for students to engage with, I'll look in a textbook and see if there are activities that support sort of the topics that I think are meaningful for my particular context and my particular students. And then I'll have students engage with those activities. And so there's just so much skipping around in the textbook. Like on day one, they might do an activity from page 300, and, you know, week 3, they might do an activity from page 3. So. And I think that is true about it. It really is hard to implement when your books do it the other way around. And that's sort of the way that I approached it, just as an individual, and then obviously, you know, sharing and collaborating with my colleagues as appropriate. But, you know, thinking about what topics and resources are important and useful, and then sort of using the textbook as a secondary resource versus a primary resource. Because I do feel, you know, like I said earlier, that textbook is expensive, so students should use it. So just the reality of the situation, we're all confined by our particular context. Okay, so thank y'all. That was good. And so, oops, with the World Readiness Standards, I do want to show you that there is language in here that opens the standards up to including these social justice learning outcomes. For example, in the comparisons standard, we talk about diverse perspectives, and in the cultures and community standards, we're talking about this idea of cultural competence. And I think social justice connects really clearly with that. This is something that our profession has thought about and struggled with for decades. So this is not something new here, right? So I have a couple of quotes that, you know, from various decades that show how language educators have sort of wrestled with this. So here Weinberg says how most activities deal with cultural distinctiveness. I talked about that earlier, focusing on what's different. And there's never any sustained attention to the ugly realities of systemic discrimination, and how responding to racist attacks and defamation is also part of the culture. And this was from 1982. Think about how often you see this represented in textbooks nowadays. Teddick and Walker, it's easier to deal with Oktoberfest, and you can put, I don't know, Days of the Dead or whatever from your particular language or a culture in there, than to explore something like the emergence of xenophobia in Germany and parallel patterns in the United States. We don't want to get our hands dirty. Stories of escaping war and finding refuge and racism in a new land are also part of the languages that we're studying, right? A lot of these languages, especially European languages, are rooted in imperialism and colonization. And I like the title of this article, A Pedagogy of Pain. And so how can we think from a curricular perspective about ways that we can incorporate culture and from a social justice perspective or from a social justice framework within our context? So I like the work that Cassandra Glenn, Pam Leslie, and Beth Wassel have put together. A lot of you might be familiar with this publication from ACTFL, but they look at the products, practices, and perspectives and think about how can we be more critical about the way that we think about these. So products are no longer just things like books, tools, foods, laws, etc., but we're talking about access to tangible and intangible resources. Practices are not just what people do, but we're looking at complexity of interactions among and within communities, social hierarchies, marginalized communities. Perspectives, not just what people think, but we're looking at socially constructed ideologies like race and gender roles. Kubota has what she calls the 4 Ds. So the first one, taking a descriptive versus a prescriptive approach to culture, describing the culture instead of saying what culture should be, looking at diversity, variability, and complexity within culture, realizing that culture is dynamic, it's not frozen in time, so it needs to be studied in that way because social values and beliefs change throughout history. And focusing on the discursive nature of culture, the discursive construction of knowledge, how there really are no objective truths. So a lot of you had questions about, okay, I have my curriculum materials, be it a textbook or a curriculum that's developed within my, my district or my school. What do I do? How do I start thinking about social justice within that context? And so one way to do that is to think about what are some points of entry based on what you already teach in your class. So start with what we already do. What are some possibilities? What are some opportunities that are already present in the curriculum? So Terry Osborne has thought through this a little bit, and in his publication, Teaching World Languages Through Social Justice, he looks at linguistic context and functions, and he has 4 categories: identity, social architecture, language choices, and activism. And so just really quickly, we can look and see how each of these more critical topics can fit into what we already do in the classroom. So for example, linguistic context and functions relating to identity. Students can start talking about this as soon as they learn the verb to be, right? They can start talking about some of the issues that you see on this slide or some of the things that you see on this slide. Social architecture. So think about how many textbooks have units on schools, on likes and dislikes and media and entertainment, and how many opportunities there are to just incorporate a more critical perspective to these topics. And I have a couple of examples for that in a second. Language choices, not taking for granted the nuances of power. And I would add power to the other the other P's. Yeah, perspectives, practices, and products, and then power, not taking for granted the nuances of power when we talk about culture. And activism, thinking about how we can replace sort of traditional assignments and assessments with other products that may have some utility outside of the classroom or within the context of the students' own lives. And then when I think about it through that framework, these are just some topics that I think can easily be embedded into any curriculum at any level in a language classroom. So these are just some topics, critical topics to think about as you're thinking about how to incorporate culture into the classroom using a social justice framework. Stacey Margarita Johnson, who is awesome and who's going to do another webinar on this same topic. And I can't wait to hear what she has to say. She's one of my heroes. This is a picture of us at 2 different ACTFL conferences. But anyway, we wrote this article in the Language Educator. It's very brief, and we talk about just generally, how do we get started with connecting social justice and critical pedagogy? And so there are a couple of essential questions that I want to talk about. So first, who is the source of knowledge? Thinking about how can we give students autonomy and choice and engage those students in self-evaluation. And these are some tools that I use and that I have been using more now that we are all online. All of my classes are online, asynchronous this semester. So hopefully after each of these questions, I can pause and we can incorporate your thoughts and suggestions and insights. So one thing that I do is I create a Padlet for a lot of topics where students can upload images or even videos or thoughts or ideas about a particular topic. And I use that to sort of drive the way that we discuss that topic. I have used Twitter in the past. In the composition class, I required my students to have a Twitter account. And whenever they did a composition or writing assignment, they would tweet about it and try to engage other people, the larger community in that discussion. I love VoiceThread. My university pays for it, but I think that is one thing that I would pay for out of my pocket if I had to. But just allowing students to engage and interact with presentations. And also one cool thing about VoiceThread is that students can embed their own slides into a presentation. And so, so I love that, ending a presentation on an open-ended note and saying, okay, now you upload something to that adds your own perspective to this that I didn't talk about because I'm only one person. There's no way that I could have brought in all of the important perspectives. So what would you like to add to this conversation, and giving them the autonomy to do that? Speaking of autonomy, I use Google tools a lot. All of my students in all of my language classes have their own blog. So they have their own personal space where they upload their projects. So instead of having them turn in things to me, they upload the assignments, and I go to them. I go to their space and engage with them, and I found that to be effective with establishing autonomy. And then of course we all know and love Flipgrid, and I would like to know what other tools you all have been using. If you could put those in the chat, I'll come back to that. I'll give you a second to do that, but I'll continue talking and then we'll come back and look at that. And then thinking about student autonomy, what are your students already creating? And so our students don't come to us as blank slates. A lot of times they have already engaged in these topics. They've already thought deeply about these critical topics that we want to include in our classes. And they, in many cases, have produced products based on their analysis and their interaction and their engagement with these topics. So here are examples from my class, and all of these are published works that are publicly available. So if you would like to have access to any of these, I can share the link where you can find it. But this was from a high school student, actually, who wrote a poem about her thoughts about immigration. I'm not afraid of the water. And so I was able to incorporate that into our classes. In another class, we were looking at the idea of bad hair and good hair and identity and colorism. And one of my students had published a semi-autobiographical piece called Nappy Headed. And so with her permission, these are all things that my students have shared with me. And then I go to them and ask, hey, can we incorporate this into a class? And so it's just great to have the perspectives of the people who are in the class to be able to lead these discussions and also to contextualize it within the immediate context of our students. And then another example, this is Father Tongue, written by one of my composition students. And this was from last summer. And the cool thing about this is this was an online class. And so even if you don't have those face-to-face relationships with your students, you can still find out what they're engaged in and try to incorporate that into the class. So she had written a poem about her struggle with, not knowing Spanish to the extent that she wanted to, even though she was to some extent bilingual in Spanish and English. And so she composed this really intimate piece about her relationship to the language. And so I thought that was just so cool. And I incorporated this into the class, and I used it in the same lesson that I used a video. I can't remember the exact title of the poem, but it was something like "To All the White Girls in My Spanish Class," but it was the same type of theme. And speaking of resources, let me go back to the board and see what other things people have talked about with regard to giving students autonomy. Kate, you might have to help me. I'm scrolling up. I saw some things. I saw Jamboard. I saw Pear Deck, but now I think they're just too far away for me to find them, those comments.
Are you just trying to gather some of the resources that people were using?
Yeah, yeah.
I know I saw
Screencast-O-Matic, so yeah.
Perusal came up a couple of times.
The annotation tool, Perusal, yeah.
ThingLink, yeah, Jamboard got multiple mentions. Mentimeter, I don't know if I'm saying that, Mentimeter, I'm not sure if I'm saying that one right.
Mentimeter, I don't know that one. So Stacy, you might have to include a link in the chat to that so that people can access it. I see someone else said it too, Erica. So yeah, looking forward to engaging and learning from the things that you all mentioned as well. So the next thing I want to talk about, the next question, what resources do we use in the classroom? So thinking about how we can incorporate counterpoint and authentic resources. And I know that word authenticity has a lot of baggage associated with it. You know, what is authentic? Who gets to decide what's authentic? But when I think of authentic resources, I don't even think it has to be something that's not pedagogical. I just think something that is that respectfully respects the perspectives of the people being portrayed. And I think to do that well, you have to. It's better if it comes from the people who are actually being portrayed in that work. But then I also understand that maybe someone would like to publish something about their life, but they aren't, you know, writing isn't their skill. They might need help from a publisher or someone else to be able to write their story, even though they're the ones telling it. And so I think that even if that person isn't the author, if they are involved in the telling of that story, I think that counts as something that's authentic because it, you know, respectfully reflects the perspective of the person that's being portrayed. And y'all can help me you know, wrestle with that a little bit more. I always struggle with that word authentic and sort of what I mean by that. But so with regard to resource selection, I'm thinking about open resources that don't oversimplify diversity or gloss over controversy or inequality. And also think about where are you looking? These are places where I have found awesome resources. And in my classes, it all boils down to those essential questions and the resources. That's sort of the backbone of my class, the resources that I select or that my students select, and then those essential questions. And that sort of guides the curriculum in my class. And I found that that's a great way to sort of have a class that's grounded in social justice pedagogy. So looking at different blogs of people, Twitter, of course, from the Lane Chat community, specialized community groups, for example, ACTFL SIGs usually have very lively discussion boards where there is lots of great resource sharing happening. Facebook, one of my favorite groups is a group called Incorporating Afro-Latino Culture in Spanish Classroom. And someone asked if I can share Pedagogy of Pain. I certainly can. I'll get the full citation of that for you. Podcasts, and then obviously I already mentioned our own students, and then our own research and our own experiences, thinking about to what extent we ourselves are engaging with and consuming the perspectives of marginalized groups. So looking at our own Twitter feed, the books that we're reading, the shows that we're watching. What are we consuming? Are we sort of organically, naturally getting those marginalized perspectives, or are we, consuming perspectives that represent the majority? An example of that, this is something that I do when we talk about entertainment. I link it to entertainment and talking about the films that students enjoy and the types of media that they like to engage with. And so with this, you have 𝘊𝘮𝘮𝘀𝘀 and 𝘊𝘰𝘮𝘮𝘀𝘀 talking about their experiences being Afro-Latina women. And I believe 𝘊𝘮𝘮𝘀𝘀 mentioned in another interview, even though she's Cuban, she's never had a role where she played a Latina. She is always an English-speaking Black woman, even though she speaks Spanish fluently, and she is she is of Cuban descent. And so when students work with this, we talk about the basic present tense, introductions. I link it to narrating in the past. Students compose either a Padlet or a Flipgrid, depending on the context. And they make a post, sort of like what you see here, but in the target language, combating a misconception about themselves. And so they're using those structures, but they're able to do it in a way that is more critical, but then also more meaningful for them because they're sharing something important about themselves with the class. And so I think it helps to build community and trust as well. And I think it's important. I had to catch myself with this, with the 𝘊𝘮𝘮𝘀𝘀𝘀𝑡𝑜𝑟𝑡𝑜's quote, where she talks about, she realized early on that people like they like their Latinas to look Italian and not like me. My initial thought was to ask students, do you agree or disagree with that statement? And I had to catch myself because that type of question is lazy, first of all. And then also it sort of puts her in a place, even though we don't know her personally, but I've been there, where you're put in a place where you have to sort of defend your own marginalization, or sort of quote unquote prove that your own marginalization exists. And so I think we have to be careful with those do you agree, disagree type questions. What I ended up asking the students instead was, what experiences do you think that she has had that has led her to have that perspective? And how do you think we can get to a place where people will no longer have this thought? What would it take for her and for our society to not be in this place where people have that perception of the film industry? And so we're taking a more critical and more proactive approach, while also sort of acknowledging and respecting the perspective of the person who is being very vulnerable about sharing about their own marginalization. And of course, I have a tweet. This is from Robert Jones. I like this statement. He says, we can disagree and still love each other unless our disagreement is rooted in unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. So I think there is definitely space to critically engage and to grapple with questions, but we should never put someone's humanity or right to exist up for debate. So I think we have to be really careful with how we frame those types of discussion questions. Do you all have any additional thoughts? We can pause here for a second, and if you have specific thoughts about resource selection or any questions about what I've said recently.
Can I bring in actually one question that came up in the Q&A that I think is relevant to what you've been talking about, and that was from Hope. With having students engage with these digital resources and broadcast themselves, or even in a class using Zoom or a Google Doc, all of these forms that can be shareable, where some students might have some nervousness or some reticence with discussing those topics because it could be captured and shared, or because siblings or parents might be listening in. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions about that? And this is I'm putting LJ on the spot because he's our moderator, but if other people have suggestions in the chat, please do contribute with how people are kind of coping with this digital reality of having these discussions.
Yeah, that's important. I will say, one thing that comes to mind when I had students engage in Twitter, I gave them the option of posting to the private discussion board instead if they felt like what they had to say, they didn't want to get responses to their comment. So I tried to give them a space where they have a private space and they also have a public space, and they get to kind of choose how they want to engage. And then maybe all of my classes are asynchronous, so students theoretically can find time on their own schedule to sort of be alone if they want to write something or if they want to say something that they don't want other people to hear. But I think if you teach synchronously, just giving students that option of, and I think Flipgrid is great for that, for them to be able to sort of asynchronously engage, but still be able to engage in the conversation. Yeah, and I like Anna's question because that comes up in just a second. There's a whole slide for that.
I was going to actually go ahead and put that one out there, but maybe I'll just mention it and then we know that you're coming around to it, which is the question of how to establish that environment that she says enables courageous conversations. And I think that relates to the tweet that you've got up right now as well.
And then someone says, giving them reflections that only that only the professor reads. And one thing that I do with my classes is I think I plan to talk about this a little bit later. I put them in small groups. So they work in my online classes, they work in small groups of like 6 to 8 students for the entire semester. So they're never in that large classroom environment. So we do a lot of team building activities within that group to sort of develop trust and to maintain trust. And so I think that helps them to be a little bit more comfortable with sharing some of these potentially controversial opinions and perspectives. Because I think there does have to be that trust there in order for there to be forgiveness if you say something wrong, or in order for there to even be honesty, there has to be some type of trust within the circle of people with whom you're speaking.
That's great, thank you.
And so how do we promote language proficiency within a critical framework? So I want to talk a little bit about contextualization using technology and strategic use of English. And I think this came up earlier. Like I said, for me, everything is about those essential questions, and then having resources that support the perspectives that I think are important to include in the class. And so here's an example of how I take sort of traditional language functions and think about how I can create an essential question that would allow me to take a social justice oriented approach to that, that particular language function. And so describing myself and others and talking about the present, those are things that if I wanted to, I could just use the textbook. The textbook has activities for days about that, right? But my essential question is, how do we construct and perform our individual and social identities? And so then that opens up what I do to be able to talk about intersectionality, racial justice, and activism with my students, while still using those same forms and functions that they would have been using anyway if we were talking about more superficial topics. So that's an example of how I think essential questions can really help frame the way that we approach these topics. And then I think another thing that we're all worried about, if we're using these resources that weren't specifically created for the proficiency level that we're teaching, what can we have students do? How can we have them engage? So here are just some quick tips. Sometimes I have them write a title for a paragraph or a section, express their reaction with a tweet, so just in 140 characters or less, underline or highlight what they think are the most important sentences, or I might develop very basic true, false, or multiple choice questions based on key points that I think students should be able to understand. Some other ideas that I don't have on the slide: a teacher could create a list of sentences and have the students put them in order based on level of importance, or based on order of events, depending on what the comprehension goals are. I try not to modify the resource because I don't want to change what the perspective that the person was presenting. I don't want the perspective to then become filtered through what I believe was important. So I try my best to not modify the language, but think about how I can engage students in a way that will not have them be overwhelmed when they're looking at these texts or watching these videos when they can't understand every single word, right, being said. And I have some examples of what that looks like. So this is from Meredith White. She has one word answer. So giving students a maximum of one word to answer the question. So just making sure that they can understand the key details based on the headline or based on just a few sentences of the article. I love Edpuzzle. I don't know if anyone mentioned that in the chat when we were talking about technology tools, but you can link it to a video that's already on YouTube, or you can upload your own video. This is a video where Tostao from the group Tokitown is talking about how the group came to be and what issues are important to them. And really quickly, I see a question. Yes, the question is about, do I present the essential questions in English for novice and lower intermediate? And I do. When I give an overview of the lesson, sometimes I might have those questions in English. I think the overview page for the modules that I teach online, that overview page is usually all in English, and then the activities that they do associated with that are then in the target language, which is in my case is Spanish. So you can do like a movie talk where you narrate certain scenes. You can upload multiple choice, open-ended questions. So I have here an example of a multiple choice question. And so it's really cool. It pauses the video, it shows the question, and then when the student answers the question, you can incorporate feedback, written feedback or oral feedback. I also use Google Docs to collaboratively gloss and annotate text. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a second. And then also, I don't know how many of you use embedded reading activities, but I found this to be a great way to help make certain texts comprehensible, especially songs. And here's an example of what that might look like. This is from Kara Jacobs, 𝘊𝘰𝘮𝘭𝘵𝘮𝘪𝘯𝘨. And so you start out by just selecting the words that will help students understand the gist of what is happening. So this will be level 1. So you engage students with this, and then you move to level 2 where you add more words from the lyrics, level 3, and then finally the entire song. Whereas if you started here, this might have been too overwhelming for the students and they just might have given up. But if you start here, you can see, students can see, oh, I actually understand what's going on. And then they just sort of move up and add more details. And then we talked about this earlier. I think it's important to think about how we can strategically use English in our classes. So I encourage students to engage in translanguaging, and I encourage critical reflection in English. And here's an example of that. This is an example of what I do with reading. So sometimes I'll gloss certain words using the comment feature in Google Docs. And there are other more sophisticated annotation tools that you can use, but you know, Google Docs is free and it's accessible and most students are familiar with it. And so I have students, they can see my comments. Sometimes I'll ask them questions and they can type in their responses. Oftentimes I'll say, you can respond in English or Spanish, depending on what you want to say. So I kind of leave it up to them. If they feel that, that they can express it in Spanish and that their classmates, their intended audience will understand it, then they can comment in Spanish. And this topic in particular was important because this is about the murder of Alexa Negron Luciano in Puerto Rico, and about Bad Bunny's advocacy for this. And it goes back to that idea of mattering as an element of social justice, because how often can we go through an entire textbook or an entire curriculum document and not see a trans person at all, right? Or if we do see minoritized people, it's just the bare minimum. It's just the representation piece, but we don't, the tokenism, we don't really think about what perspectives they bring and what value they bring to the curriculum and to what we're studying. So with this article, they answer some comprehension questions in Spanish, and then for some of the other activities, I don't want to say I allow them to use English. I encourage them to engage in translanguaging and to use English if they need to do this piece, because otherwise I feel like they are getting that input that they need in order to meet the language learning goals that I have. And I don't want their language to hinder their ability to engage with the topic that's so important. And I think number 3 on this list, that ended up being a great activity where students go to Twitter or Instagram and you have them search for a particular hashtag that's related to a particular social justice movement. And then they can, in a discussion board, link to that post and discuss it and explain why it caught their eye or why they thought that was important. And then I want to pause here to think about what other strategies have you found to be successful for understanding and engaging with authentic text? Yes, perusal. I see in the comments, people are talking about perusal. That's a great tool as well. And again, for what I think VoiceThread, a combination of VoiceThread and Google Docs does what I need them to do. And so for that reason, I just use those. I would like to answer Luis's question about how would you develop cultural awareness in an asynchronous environment. I think I need more context for that one, actually. Yes, memes are great because the language is usually accessible. Actually reaching out to the author. Thanks, Manuela. So I'll go ahead and the last question here is, how do we respond to controversy? I think one of the main things that we can do is to be proactive. And I have this here. Obviously, I'm not going to read all this to you, but this is what I put in my syllabus. I let students know where I stand, what I believe about language learning and what I believe about anti-racism and anti-colonial approaches. And so we are clear about that from the beginning. And I also tell them we're not going to solve these issues. We're just growing and we're on this journey together. And I hope that they will engage with me. And I like Glenn Singleton's concept for courageous conversation. I saw someone mention that earlier about establishing guidelines for how to engage in these conversations. So stay engaged, speak your truth, say what you believe, and speak about your own experiences. Experience discomfort. I'm uncomfortable talking about a lot of these things. I tell my students that it's completely normal to feel uncomfortable about this, and to expect and accept non-closure, that we're not going to solve these things. And so what I want to do is finally, as I end, just show you an example of what this might look like in a within the context of an entire unit. So this is something that I co-developed with one of my student teachers, Ashley Compton, and Christy Lee was her partnership teacher at the high school level. This was for a Spanish level 2 class. So they were learning about descriptive adjectives and nationalities. These were probably novice mid, novice high learners. So they can formulate basic sentences in the present tense. This is what we're dealing with our textbook. You know, there's no context here. They're just filling in the blank with adjectives, focusing on agreement. Same thing here, indicating the nationalities of these famous people. And then in the corner here with the Alfonso Cuarón, you can see the by the way approach. Hey, by the way, here's some unrelated fact about this person. And then here, this is what I mean by the tokenism without any real criticality applied to it. So there's an attempt at representation, but there's no critical lens. You have a Black person presented in the text, but it's about her finding an ideal boyfriend. So very superficial treatment. And so what the student and I developed is thinking about what the novice learner can do and how can we take a critical approach to the same topic. This was the social justice objective: discuss and reflect upon the complexities of racial identity, still doing the same language functions and forms that they had done before. And so they start off with a collaborative activity. They do this in Spanish. Do you think you have a racial identity on a scale of 1 to 10? How might it affect your life? So this is low stakes, sets the stage for more critical reflection. What are the most important aspects of your identity? Have you ever had to maintain a double identity? And then in addition to that, is this systemic? And so getting students to think about what the difference is between sort of systemic racism and individual prejudice. And this is a high school. And in this video, I won't show it because we're running out of time here, but this video is in English, and it goes back to that whole idea of translanguage. And if you want to learn more about that, 𝘊𝘰𝘮𝘪𝘯𝘵 is a great resource. But I feel like I don't get to choose how people express themselves or what counts as authentic. So if a person expresses their perspective in English and it's completely relevant to what we are discussing, and they are a member of the community that we are learning about, then I incorporate that resource, because I think that is so, I don't think I should shut them out just because the resource is not in Spanish, because the perspective is so important. But you can look at the vocabulary that's being used and bring it back and incorporate that into the class. And so what she also has students do was read these excerpts from people who identified as Blaxican. And we're not going to go through them, but there are 4 individuals here. And you will find that although all 4 of these people are from pretty much the same region, generally in California, they have very different experiences. And so I think things like this help to combat stereotypes and to reinforce that culture is not monolithic. And then they move to the critical reflection in English. And what they do is they talk about, why did they think the teacher chose this topic? Is it relevant to their context, and why or why not? And at this time, this was in the wake of the Michael Brown shooting. And unfortunately, this is still an issue, right? And students talked about police violence and perspectives that people had about police violence based on their own racial identity. You can see here what the Black people who were surveyed versus the white people who were surveyed thought about how race connected to what was happening at this time. And so then they move on to critical reflection in English about how they can be an ally in their daily life for issues that may not explicitly relate to their own identity. So in this context, if you're not Black, how might you be an advocate for Black Lives Matter movement? If you're not trans, how can you be an advocate or an ally for people who are trans within your particular community? And so that's just a sampling of some of the activities that students did. And I think it was important because in the reflection, students said that that this was the first time that they discussed race in a multiracial environment. And I think that was so cool that that could happen, you know, in 10th grade Spanish at this particular school. So that was exciting. And so I think I'll go ahead and end it there. The only other thing that I wanted to mention was to think about how we can link what happens in our own communities to what is happening within our curriculum. So to think more broadly about that. So linguistic landscape projects are great ways to do that, to look at how the language is used in your own community and how representation happens within your community. And then these slides will be shared. I just have some next steps that you might want to think about, but we'll end it there. I think there might be it's 2:30 now, so maybe I don't know if there's some flexibility to maybe have a couple of questions or while you're completing that evaluation.
There's definitely flexibility. I think what we're going to do is pop up the evaluation so that people have it there. And we also just want to be respectful of your time, but if you're willing to stay on for 5 or so more minutes to see if there are any questions or discussions, that would be wonderful. I do want to make sure, and I think from the discussion, everyone would agree with me that I recognize this was a really wonderful, rich talk and set of resources and questions and possibilities for us to all start working with. So, so that we make sure in the discussion that we don't lose sight of it, can we all thank L.J. Randolph for this wonderful webinar and for the discussion that he's led and prompted? You all, I can't unmute you, so I'll clap for you. You can do your virtual clapping.
Thank you. And I look forward to going back and reading through the chat and, you know, seeing what thoughts you all had during the webinar. So thank you.
Yes, we will. We realize that the settings are such that people can't copy that themselves. So we're going to figure out a way to share a transcript of that when we share the videos. You've done such a great job of answering the questions along the way that I think there aren't a lot of open-ended ones. I think maybe one of the questions that's come up in a couple of different ways, and that I think also often comes up in discussions around social justice in language teaching and anti-racism in language teaching, is the question of positionalities of teachers. And I think that came up from Evelyn and also a little bit in the chat discussion of how people bringing their various identities, for example, teachers who are Black, teachers who are white, teachers who are Latinx, can negotiate their own positionality within these discussions. So if you have any thoughts about that.
I just try to recognize that we are all very subjective and that it's impossible for me to be objective with these topics. So I don't even try. My students, they know how I feel, and sometimes with certain topics, I also talk about how I get emotional about them, because like I get emotional about when we talk about race sometimes, because it brings up trauma that I have experienced based on a racism that I've experienced in my life. And so, and I respect that other people based on other topics may experience that same level of trauma in different contexts. So I just try to embrace it, and that's part of that whole messiness and part of the whole lack of closure that we're going to have, and part of that discomfort that we talk about. That's normal, and it should be, that discomfort should be normalized. And if it happens within a context where there is authenticity and there's trust with the people who are engaged in that conversation, I think that's where the real transformation can happen.
That's beautiful. That's a really nice kind of way of summarizing a lot of the things that I've heard you say as well. I really appreciated you making the point that this isn't about the teacher pushing a particular perspective, but about making space for the variety of voices in the classroom. But that also includes the teacher's voice and their experiences.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you so much again. And yeah, I feel like we could have kept this discussion going all day, and maybe we'll have a chance down the road to invite you out here to Arizona and do a longer workshop, but this was really wonderful. And so we will be sharing all these resources with you all. And again, if you are interested in this topic in particular, or I think really anyone who's a language teacher should consider signing up for the rest of this webinar series as well. And as LJ mentioned, I think there'll be differences, but a lot of also echoes across Stacey Margarita Johnson's talk that's coming up next.
Yes.